Hi everybody and welcome to the latest video in our series accompanying AQA's Modern Britain Unit, Unit 2S. We're going to continue to look at the Wilson government, the Labour government of 1964 to 70 in this video, focusing in particular on three issues which caused real problems for Wilson and his government. The first is the trade unions and particularly Labour's relationship with the unions. The second issue is divisions within Wilson's own cabinet between Wilson and several leading members. And the third is the issue of Northern Ireland. So first of all, let's look at the trade unions. If you've seen the post-war consensus video, you'll know that the consensus was about the Labour and Conservative governments of the 51 through to 70 period, in fact the 45 through to 70 period, sharing agreement on a number of issues. When we look at the policies of those governments, whether Labour or Conservative, we see real overlap on several issues. One of those issues was a commitment to full employment, which doesn't mean that every single person all the time is going to be in work, but it does mean a commitment to getting unemployment absolutely as low as possible. And part of that commitment as well involved working cooperatively with the trade unions. And when we looked even at the Conservative governments of 51 through to 64, that commitment was very much in place. And as we move into the 60s, we find that the trade unions are pretty popular with the public. Around 60% of people, a pretty high percentage in an opinion poll, have a favourable view of trade unions. Wilson himself, as a Labour politician, is close to the unions. He even appoints Frank Cousins, who's a very senior union leader, as part of his government as Minister of Technology. And as well as believing in cooperating with the unions on principle, Wilson knows on a practical level that if his prices and incomes policies are going to work, he's going to need to work closely with the trade unions. Having said that, problems arise midway through Wilson's time in office. In 66 through to 67, we have a series of what we call wildcat strikes. Now, a wildcat strike is an unofficial strike. This is a strike which breaks out in a local area among local union members without permission from the top, without even referring necessarily to national union leaders. And these wildcat strikes are carried out by dockers and by seamen in 1966 through to 1967. And this suggests a couple of things to us. First of all, it suggests that the union bosses, who traditionally had really quite significant power, were to an extent losing some of their grip, certainly losing some of their influence over groups of ordinary local members. But these wildcat strikes also show us and contribute to the problems, the economic problems that Wilson's government was facing. And so Wilson has a difficult decision to make. He wants to retain a positive, cooperative relationship with the unions. He believes in strong trade unions. He's not suddenly abandoned his socialist principles. But equally, Wilson knows that if strikes get out of control, then there are going to be serious ramifications for the economy. And that point of view is shared by Barbara Castle. Now, Barbara Castle is a leading member of Wilson's government. She's employment minister, responsible for relations with the trade unions, and Castle, like Wilson, is very much a supporter of trade unions, but like Wilson too, she shares that view that the unions need to be kept under some sort of control. Not banned, clearly, not clamped down on to too great an extent, but the issue of unofficial strikes does need dealing with. And so Barbara Castle sets out some plans to try and reform the trade unions. Her aim is to keep unions strong, but at the same time to protect the economy, and in particular to look into this issue of unofficial strikes. And Barbara Castle publishes these plans in a document which is called In Place of Strife. Strife meaning conflict. Clearly her aims are there, aren't they? She wants to avoid conflict, and that's published at the beginning of 1969. Now, straight away, the unions are very unhappy with the In Place of Strife document. There are certain parts of it in particular that the unions object to. First of all, Castle is proposing a 28-day, what she calls a cooling off period. In other words, once the strike has been announced, there would then have to be a 4-week delay in which hopefully further negotiating could take place before a strike went ahead. And unions said no, this gives too much power and influence back to the employers. The second issue is one of strike ballots. Now, Castle was worried about unofficial strikes, but what she was also worried about was union leaders taking a decision to go on strike, even if most ordinary members were against it or had no strong feelings. So in Place of Strife said there may be cases where the government will impose a strike ballot, will say, if you are planning to go on strike, then your members will have to vote on it. A ballot is simply a vote. And again, the unions say, no, this is wrong. This is trying to limit our power. The third proposal that is pretty controversial with the unions is with reference to what we call demarcation disputes. Now, a demarcation dispute is where two different trade unions in a workplace come into conflict with each other. It may be that one union represents one group of workers, one union represents a second group of workers, and it's a dispute over which group of workers is responsible for doing a particular job or task in the workplace. Those disputes are called demarcation disputes, and what Castle is suggesting and proposing is that in those cases where there seems to be no resolution, the government could step in and actually impose a settlement and decide what to do with those unions and with those workers. And again, the unions say this is taking power away from the unions and giving it too much to the government. And clearly the unions are not very happy with these proposed new rules, so they're equally very unhappy with the idea that perhaps we ought to have an industrial relations court to prosecute the unions and the union leaders and the members who actually break the new proposed rules as well. And that aspect of In Place of Strife is just as controversial as the other parts. Now, the interesting thing is that actually a lot of the public, although they support the unions, they also support In Place of Strife. It has the backing of a lot of senior Labour MPs. This is not just Wilson and Castle, but lots of cabinet members, very senior people such as Roy Jenkins, who's Chancellor by this stage, are in favour of In Place of Strife. But there is a lot of opposition as well, and this opposition doesn't just come from the unions, although union opposition is very strong. Jack Jones, who's General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers Union, the TGW, he's a very powerful union leader. It's a massive union. Jack Jones is a leading figure in the opposition to In Place of Strife. But it isn't just union leaders. There's around about 50 Labour MPs who make it clear to Wilson that they will not back down and they will absolutely not support these proposals. Crucially, Jim Callaghan, who we've met before, he's Home Secretary at the time, and he says he will fight this every step of the way. So Callaghan, as a senior cabinet member, in direct conflict with Wilson and with Castle. And that opposition, particularly the opposition from Callaghan, is enough to force Wilson and Castle ultimately to back down. So In Place of Strife remains just a plan. It never comes into law. It never gets through Parliament. It's ultimately pulled before that stage because Wilson knows the strength of opposition within his own party, from within his own cabinet, from among some of his MPs, and from so many union leaders is simply too significant to ignore. And of course, for Wilson and Castle, this is deeply disappointing. It's really a pretty humiliating climb down. The unions, Callaghan, are delighted, but of course, some of those economic issues that unofficial strikes in particular have caused are not going to be resolved with this state of affairs. So the relationship between the unions and Labour, something which potentially ought to be pretty positive for a Labour government, as we can see, is something that's causing real problems for Wilson. Let's move on to the next issue which causes Wilson significant problems, which is the issue of divisions within his own cabinet. This is an interesting one because, of course, when we talked about Labour divisions back in the 1950s, it was very much about ideology, about belief. We had Bevan and the Bevanites on the left of the party, with support for full-scale nationalisation. A lot of the Bevanites were very supportive of unilateral nuclear disarmament. On the right of the party, we had Gaitskell, far more of a commitment to a mixed economy, very hostile to the idea of unilateral nuclear disarmament, suspicious of CND, for example. So it was very much an ideological dispute. Wilson, although he'd been a Bevanite originally, once he becomes leader, very much emerges through the centre of the Labour Party. And on an ideological level, he's actually able pretty effectively to unite the left and the right of the party. His focus on technology, on modernisation, on science, on progress is something that all of the Labour Party can get behind. This is not an issue particularly of left or right, and so Wilson very cleverly is able to do that. So we might think, well, what is the problem then? The problem very much is an issue of rivalry on a personal level. It's partly an issue of ambition and power. It's an issue as well of personality clashes. And the key people here who cause Wilson real headaches are George Brown. We've come across Brown before. He was briefly in charge of the short-lived Department of Economic Affairs, which of course was set up to try and do some long-term economic planning. We've got Jim Callaghan, who we've just met as Home Secretary, and we've got Roy Jenkins, who we've talked about a lot when we've talked about liberalising reforms, for instance. So let's have a look at each of these people in turn. First of all, we've got George Brown. Now, George Brown was the defeated candidate in the leadership election when Wilson succeeded Gaitskell. That's something which Brown took very badly. Equally, in 1964, when Brown gets the DEA job, he'd actually hoped for the role of Foreign Secretary. Foreign Secretary is seen as one of the 4 most senior roles in the cabinet, and the fact that Brown doesn't get that is a real blow to him as well. Now, Brown has a reputation as a very, very heavy drinker, possibly an alcoholic. There's loads of embarrassing incidents that Brown gets involved with, most of which involve alcohol. And the rumour is that Wilson actually keeps all of these on file, ready, presumably, to use at some point. Wilson's big fear with Brown, and it's true with Wilson and Jenkins and Wilson and Callaghan as well, is that one of these people will challenge him. These are senior, experienced politicians with ambition and popularity as well. And so with Brown, despite the embarrassing incidents, Wilson knows that there's still a possibility Brown may give it a go, may have a go at a leadership challenge. So no wonder Wilson wants to keep on top of that list of incidents that Brown is involved in. Let's have a look at Jenkins as well. Now, to an extent, this begins as an ideological issue. Jenkins had very much been a Gaitskellite. He comes from the right of the party. And it's not just that either. We talked, when we mentioned liberal reforms, we talked about the fact that Jenkins was fully committed to these. Jenkins, in many ways, more of a small L liberal than a socialist, really. Wilson, on the other hand, believes that socialism and economic policy is crucial. Wilson isn't opposed to all the liberal reforms, but neither is he fully convinced by them or fully convinced they're such a priority. Wilson also is very, very concerned. Wilson develops almost a paranoia around leadership challenges. When Jenkins begins to push for devaluing the pound, which of course we know happens eventually, Wilson sees this as some kind of plot. Wilson believes that Jenkins wants to devalue because devaluation is embarrassing. It will discredit Wilson. Wilson will then have to go and Jenkins will get his job. Now this is all going on in Wilson's head. Does Jenkins have ambition? Does Brown? Does Callaghan? Absolutely. Is Wilson too worried about this? Is he too paranoid? Almost certainly. However, let's have a look at Callaghan. Now, Wilson distrusts Callaghan. Wilson knows that Callaghan is another potential leadership challenger. But with Callaghan, actually, a lot of his issues are with Jenkins. Now, it's interesting because Callaghan and Jenkins are both seen as being on the right of the party. You wouldn't imagine. they disagreed on too much, but nevertheless, actually, there are 4 issues where Callaghan and Jenkins, who don't like each other personally either, but also they disagree on these issues. On the EEC, Jenkins is very pro-European, very pro-joining the EEC. Callaghan, much more opposed to that. On social policy, we know Jenkins takes a very liberal line. Callaghan, even more than Wilson, is pretty conservative with a small c on some of those issues around divorce and homosexuality, for example. On devaluation, Jenkins was pushing for it. Callaghan believed it would be a mistake. And as we've just seen on reforming the unions, on In Place of Strife, Jenkins was very pro. Callaghan led the opposition to it. So this is a personal rivalry. It's also on issues of ideology as well. And one of the interesting things is that Callaghan, Jenkins and Brown as well are all from the right of the party, but none of them are particularly having a go at Wilson on an ideological level. With Wilson and these 3, it's more about ambition, about rivalry, about power. But nevertheless, when you look at Wilson, he is getting criticism because of his policies themselves. He is getting criticism on an ideological level, but that criticism actually comes from the left of the party. Increasingly, there are people on the left of the party who say to Wilson, we thought you were one of us, you were a Bevanite, you came from the left, but now you're in government. This is not a socialist government. This is not a government which feels as socialist as the Attlee government. We don't feel that you are transforming Britain in a socialist way as we had hoped and aspired to do. So Wilson has got all these problems with leading figures on the right on a personal level. He fears them, he fears challenges from them. At the same time, he's getting criticism from the left on a policy level too. Now, there's one other thing to say about these divisions. We've said Wilson, it becomes almost an obsession. It feels like paranoia. There's some truth in the fact that there's opposition to him and that these figures like Jenkins and Callaghan are a threat, but Wilson worries about this perhaps too much. Does this obsession with plotting mean that Wilson takes his eye off the ball? Would the government's economic problems have been solved more easily if Wilson was more focused on them? Possibly. It's not something we can give a definite answer to, but it's certainly an argument that's worth considering. Moving on to the final issue, and it's a really important one, it's the issue of Northern Ireland. Now, this is the first time in this course that we've mentioned Northern Ireland, and I think it's really important in order to understand what's happening in the 60s in Northern Ireland, to understand quite a lot about the wider history of Ireland. Understanding the wider history of Ireland also includes understanding the geography of Ireland as well. So here we are. This is the British Isles. We've got England, Scotland and Wales. We've got Northern Ireland and we've got the Republic of Ireland. So this is a modern day map of the British Isles. Now, there's something really important that we need to say at this point. When we're looking at the wider history of Ireland, what you need to know is that until 1922, Ireland was actually one united country. There's no such thing as Northern Ireland as a separate entity, so we simply have the island of Ireland up until 1922. However, since 1922, the map of Ireland has looked like it does there. Ireland was split in 1922 into the Republic, an independent country, and into Northern Ireland, which was part of the UK, along with England, Scotland and Wales. So here is your wider history. We're going to go on a whistle-stop tour through around about 900 years of Irish and British history. The first thing we need to know is from the 12th century onwards, way back to the reign of Henry II, England is trying to increase its power over Ireland. At this stage it's England, later it's Britain. Now this is about power, this is about territory, this is about control, this is about medieval monarchs wanting more power and more land. But another issue is thrown into the mix when we get to Henry VIII's reign. Now, Henry VIII, as many of you will know, splits from the Catholic Church. England becomes, in name at least, a Protestant country. Ireland is a hugely Catholic country, And really, other than for about 5 years under Bloody Mary, Mary I in the 1550s, England from then on, or Britain as it becomes, is a Protestant nation. So when we're looking at Britain and Ireland, this is not just an issue about Britain trying to increase its power or the amount of territory it controls. It's also an issue about Protestant Britain trying to subdue Catholic Ireland. Now, this is not in any way a religious history course, but it's worth saying at this point, just in case you're not sure, Catholicism and Protestantism are both part of the Christian church, but particularly the further back in history we go, the divisions between those two branches were incredibly significant. So when we're talking about Catholics and Protestants, we're talking about two groups of Christians who particularly back in the past had some really significant differences which for many of them back in the 16th, 17th, 18th century were literally a matter of life and death. So if we move through this slide, we can see that as we go through the 1500s and the 1600s, what English and then British monarchs are trying to do is various things. They're trying to increase the power that the British government has over Ireland, but what they're also trying to do is to make Ireland more English. In other words, a Protestant country rather than a Catholic one, a country that speaks English rather than the traditional Irish language of Gaelic, a country with English rather than traditional Irish legal systems. Some of the Irish legal systems originally were based on some of the older clan and tribal customs. A massive step in this process happens in 1800. It's what we call the Act of Union. This gets rid of the Irish Parliament entirely. Ireland, the whole of Ireland, becomes fully part of the UK, and it's ruled like every other part of the UK from London, from Westminster. Now, the 19th century is one of real turmoil in all sorts of ways in Ireland. What we eventually end up with as we move into the 20th century is something called the Anglo-Irish War, the War of Independence, between 1919 and 1921. And the rebels who are fighting for independence are ultimately pretty successful in that war. What happens after that war is a treaty signed, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and it partitions Ireland. In other words, it splits Ireland. So 6 counties in the north stay in the UK. That is what we now know as Northern Ireland. But the rest of the country becomes independent from the UK. It becomes the Irish Free State, now known as the Republic of Ireland. Now, the people who'd fought for independence, some of them were very angry about partition. They felt that the entire island of Ireland ought to be independent. And so there's actually then a civil war between groups of people who had fought alongside each other originally. Nevertheless, when all of that is said and done, partition remained, and that's the situation we're in to this day. The independent Republic of Ireland and then Northern Ireland as part of the UK. When we're talking about Ireland, it's important to have a bit of a handle on key vocab. We sometimes mention Great Britain, that's just England, Scotland and Wales. Add in Northern Ireland to Great Britain and you get the UK. If we're talking about the geographical feature that is the British Isles, that's the UK plus the Republic of Ireland. When we're talking about Northern Ireland, we'll often talk about Unionists. Unionists are Irish people, Irish politicians who believe that Northern Ireland ought to remain as part of the UK. Those Unionists who are particularly radical will be prepared to contemplate violence. We often refer to as Loyalists. We've also got nationalists. Now, nationalists were traditionally Irish people who fought against UK control. Since 1922 and partition, the key aim of Irish nationalists has been to bring Northern Ireland into the Republic. So Irish nationalists want what we refer to as a united Ireland. And again, there's a term for the more radical nationalists, the ones who often will use violence or have used violence in the past, and we call them Republicans. If you see the term Ulster, that generally these days is used as another term for Northern Ireland. So if you hear the word Ulster, what it means in our context is Northern Ireland. So, having done a brief tour of a lot of Irish history and a bit of geography and a bit of vocab, let's have a little look at what actually happens during the Wilson years in Northern Ireland. So, Northern Ireland is the part of the island of Ireland that is mainly Protestant, and so Northern Ireland is dominated by Protestants. There is a Northern Irish Parliament, although Northern Ireland is part of the UK, there is a measure of what we call devolution. Northern Ireland does have its own parliament in the 60s, which is able to take some decisions, even though overall Northern Ireland is part of the UK and is governed ultimately from Westminster. But the Northern Ireland Parliament has some power, and it's Protestants, it's Unionists who dominate that. Business and industry as well, dominated and owned primarily by Protestants. And Catholics increasingly say, look, we're being discriminated against. It appears that when it comes to jobs, when it comes to housing, even when it comes to drawing up boundaries of constituencies for council elections, for Northern Irish Parliament elections, for Westminster, in all of those cases, this system seems to be biased in favour of Protestants. And a really serious allegation is that the Northern Irish Police Force, the RUC, treats Catholics far worse than it treats Protestants. And so a little bit like in the southern states of the US, we end up with a civil rights movement. Groups of Catholic activists come together and they set up a civil rights movement to take on this discrimination, crucially through peaceful means. Now, what we then get is some of the loyalists, the more radical unionists, who look at this and they say, look, this might be peaceful at the moment, but we're pretty sure that the IRA is about to come back. Now, the IRA was a Republican group. They had led the War of Independence against British control. The IRA was committed, or had been committed, to using violence. And so although the civil rights movement is peaceful, the loyalists have this nightmare scenario that the IRA might pop back up at any time and begin a totally new campaign of violence. So what the loyalists do, almost as a kind of preemptive strike, is set up their own paramilitary groups. A paramilitary group is something, it's not an official army, but clearly it looks like an army, it's weaponized, and they say, look, we're simply getting ready so that if and when the IRA does come back, we will be able to stand against them. And in 68 and 69, in the later Wilson years, we get a huge rise in tension in Northern Ireland. There are some peaceful civil rights marches in 1968. These are attacked by loyalists, and the civil rights marchers say, look, the RUC, the police haven't protected us. This is further evidence of their discrimination. A year later, in 1969, there's a loyalist group. They call themselves the Apprentice Boys. Every year in the city of Derry in Northern Ireland, they hold a march. And this march this time is attacked by nationalists. As they march through a Catholic area called the Bogside, the Apprentice Boys come under nationalist attack. It leads to 2 days of really serious rioting, and the RUC, the police, can't get a handle on this. They don't get control back. And worse still, during this rioting, there's footage that emerges and is shown across Britain and the world of the RUC beating up some of the nationalist protesters. Once again, it looks like the RUC are targeting Catholics. And these riots don't go away. In fact, they begin to spread across towns and cities in Northern Ireland. And the Northern Irish Parliament realises something has to be done. They say to Catholics, look, we see your issues, we recognise them, we're going to work hard to sort out electoral boundaries, to deal with housing, so that the discrimination ends. Now, this is potentially good news for Catholics, but loyalists say, wait a minute, you're giving in to Catholic violence. And so actually loyalist rioting increases. Now, Wilson looks at the situation and he thinks this cannot go on. Remember, Wilson is Prime Minister of the whole UK, including Northern Ireland. And so what Wilson does in August of 69 is he sends in the British Army to restore calm. Now, on the face of it, clearly this seems like the logical thing to do, perhaps the only thing that Wilson can do in order to restore calm. However, if you're an Irish nationalist who believes that fighting against British control is so important, you see British Army soldiers suddenly coming into Northern Ireland, you're not necessarily going to welcome them with open arms. And as we return to Northern Ireland throughout the rest of the course, we'll see that Wilson's decision to send in the army was hugely controversial and caused its own really serious problems.
Huge thank you to Tom for yet another brilliant video on our playlist for 2S, which is the making of modern Britain, 1951 to 2007. And as we continue to go, Tom and I are going to keep on adding more and more videos to this playlist until we cover the entire spec. So if you haven't done so already, please subscribe, and then you'll get notifications as we add more and more videos, assuming you turn notifications on. There's also loads of other stuff on the channel covering other history topics and also A-level politics, so check out the channel and see if there's anything else in there that can be helpful for you and your studies and finding out about the world. Excellent. Thank you very much for watching, and again, big thank you to Tom.